cell phone and want to participate, I have this poll. Are you currently co-teaching in an early childhood program? And all you need to do is text to 22333, my name, Andrea, Golloh 750. I had no control over trying to make it shorter. And then you can just answer A, B, C, D, or E to participate in the poll, if you have your phones available. And so I put this slide in because the Sketch app is kind of nice. I could see that people had signed up to come to the session. I was like, oh, good. People are going to be there. But I couldn't see who everyone was. And so I had wanted to use some of that information to make sure that the presentation was useful. But I'm not sure now if the poll everywhere is working. Has anybody tried to send? Almost? I know, I just need a shorter name. There we go, okay. Oh, good, okay. And then 750. Nice. Okay, so as we're coming in and sitting down, and if you're answering, oh good, there's lots of, no, but I want to learn more, or planning on starting, and then some people who are already co-teaching. I was also curious, how many of you are teachers? Okay, what about oh, so everyone, looks like everyone raised their hand, so no administrators. Oh, we do teacher/administrator, okay, good. Because I have some special information for administrators too. So let's go ahead and move on. So hopefully you're in the right session. Hopefully with that last slide, you know that you're in the right session. So we're gonna be talking about co-teaching in early childhood and some special considerations that come up in early childhood that really aren't part of the conversation when you start talking to K-12 teachers and about their co-teaching and getting them set up for co-teaching. I am Andy Golloher. Hi. I'm an assistant professor at San Jose State. And this topic came up because we started trying to provide support for our intern teachers who were being asked to co-teach. It's a different way of providing services and that we hadn't necessarily intentionally supported before. And we knew that some of the early childhood teachers were doing it too, early childhood special ed intern teachers. But when we tried to provide like the same supports to them as we did to the K-12, it was like, this is just like the things that we're talking about aren't really a problem for you, and the challenges you're having kind of come from a different place. And so we started thinking more about the need for this conversation. So the objectives for today are first to define co-teaching, make sure that we are on the same page. Let me see if this is gonna work for me. Yeah, no, that doesn't work for me. That's okay. To identify considerations for establishing co-teaching that are unique to early childhood, special ed, early childhood, and to consider solutions for developing co-teaching partnerships in early childhood. So my first question before we move on is, what is co-teaching? Does anybody in the audience want to share? What are your thoughts? Oh wait, who said that? Huh? One classroom, two teachers. Did you want to add anything to that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, two teachers working in the same classroom. And that's pretty much the lay definition, two teachers teaching together. And there's a lot of ways that two teachers can teach together. Sometimes it's co-teaching, and when we talk about when I talk about co-teaching, because I come from the special ed world, I'm almost always talking about a special ed and general ed teacher. But there's lots of people who talk about team teaching or co-teaching, but they're actually talking about like a English teacher and a social studies teacher teaching together. And that's very different. The considerations in that relationship are different from working together as special ed, gen ed. You could also talk about in special ed, if you are in a special day class, sometimes you can talk about co-teaching as the SLP and the teacher co-teaching together. But you're not inclusive, but you're still potentially co-teaching. But for today's discussion, I really am thinking about that gen ed, special ed. So that's kind of our common definition of co-teaching. But there's been a lot of discussion about this definition of co-teaching in the field. And Marilyn Friend, has anybody heard of her? No. She's one of the experts. She and Lynn Cook started talking about co-teaching a long time ago, and she's really been honing in on this definition. And so her definition is that co-teaching is a service delivery mechanism. So if you're coming from special ed, you're thinking about what services you're providing to children with identified needs. And there's lots of ways that we can provide them with services and support, and co-teaching is one way to provide services. And it involves two or more professionals with equivalent licensure and employment status. This is important to Marilyn Friend. They share instructional responsibility and accountability for a single group of students for whom they both have ownership. And it occurs primarily in a shared classroom or workspace. And so looking at Marilyn Friend's definition, do you see any concerns here for early childhood or early childhood special ed relationships? Yeah. Preschool teachers do not have, they have a credential that's different than our plus. Yeah, so we already come up with this, what is the equivalent early childhood license or credential or permit, so that's actually going to be on a future slide. Any other concerns that might come up from that definition? I think that's my primary concern, is that equivalent, looking for equivalence. Now, I do want to, before we move forward, I want to talk about what's easy in early childhood co-teaching. And what's easy is these models for co-teaching. Like, I've never had to talk to an early childhood educator and say, let's try smaller groups. Like, can you imagine what it would look like to provide instruction in small groups in your classroom? High school teachers have a really hard time figuring this out. They're like, what, so when you look in K-12 and particularly middle and high school, you see a lot of co-teaching that looks like one teacher observing the other, and observing the class and maybe going in and providing assistance. You don't see a lot of stations. And when they figure out stations, it's just like, whoa, like this whole, and it's like early childhood, like that's what we do. Like, we're not getting a whole bunch of kids together. Well, hopefully, don't tell me that you're making your kids sit for like an hour and watch you talk. That's just not how we teach in early childhood. So I think that this is one thing where once we get over some of our hurdles, it can be very productive, and it fits in with the instructional styles of both the early childhood educator and early childhood special educator to work in those small groups. So what is the challenging? So the first question is, like, where are the children? And this is actually, I spent so many hours digging for this data, and I know I've heard it, and several recent presentations or conversations I've been in is this issue of like trying to just figure out where young children are and where they go. And so I found this information from the National Institute for Early Education Research. That they have like state by state where are kids being served. And they have it for 3 and 4-year-olds. And so you can see in California, 7% of 3-year-olds and 8% of 4-year-olds are being served in a Head Start program. And 11% of 3-year-olds and 16.5% are in a state preschool. Then we have about 20% of our TK eligible kids or our 4-year-olds are going to TK. And then they estimated 3% are in special ed classrooms that aren't also in some other, so they're not in a Head Start, state preschool, or transitional. And then this really wonderful and descriptive category of other/none, which I like just laughed at, and I was like, we can't do any better than this. So 80%, almost 80% of 3-year-olds are either in another program, maybe a family daycare, maybe a preschool center, or they're not going to preschool or daycare, and 52% of 4-year-olds. And so with this other none, I looked and looked and looked, and the most recent data I could find was from 2014, that 39.6, almost 40% of 3 to 5-year-olds in Santa Clara County are not going to a preschool program. So that kind of helps define that. So we have kids being served in many different places, and thank goodness, recently, there's been some moves to kind of to address some of the challenges that we had just from this. Because how many of you are early childhood special ed? Okay, so a lot of you. And so you probably had, similar to my experience, like looking out the window of your classroom and looking at all of those wonderful peer models playing on the playground and like not being able to join them. And just feeling like, this insurmountable barrier just to get together. And so there's movement on reducing that licensure, or reducing the barriers to getting licensure that will allow our programs to work together. So I'm very excited about that. When you look at kids who are in the early childhood special ed setting, which is about 5.5% of the population of 3 to 5-year-olds, in California, 45% of them are in some sort of inclusive program. And that means that they're getting because I combined more and less than 10 hours a week. But their services are all provided in some sort of early childhood space. And 42% are in a separate space, so like their services are all provided either in a clinic for speech therapy or a special day class. And then we have 12% are coded as dual enrolled, and so that means that they go to some sort of early childhood program, but their services are provided elsewhere. And you can see that actually compared to the national average, where we are in inclusion is about the same, but we have some different data for this separate and dual enrolled. Although I was talking to someone who knows a lot more about the data that's reported to Department of Ed, and they're like, oh, people just like really aren't consistent about that dual enrolled status, like whether or not they count a child as dual enrolled. So one of the first questions we have in teacher preparation is like, where's our co-teacher? How are we going to form this relationship? And districts have been doing some really creative things. So partnering with our Head Starts and state preschools, and mostly Head Starts. And so that has been a challenge to kind of work around some of the different requirements. Like, yes, Head Start has 10% of their placements are reserved for children with IEPs, but if those kids aren't there at the beginning of the year, they need kids in the program. They have a wait list. They're not just going to hold an empty space. And so that's been a kind of logistical challenge. How many of you went to the getting to the yes yesterday? Yeah, that was so interesting. So they actually, Pleasanton School District just decided to create a recreation preschool. And so they don't really have a co-teacher, except for maybe their paras that are now getting their assistant teacher permits. So that's our first question. Then we also have this issue that you guys already pointed up of who's teaching the children. Our early childhood ed counterparts have this, and it's logically, I'm like, this is actually a really nice system. You start out as just an assistant, and once you have a minimal level of education in the field, so this is three courses or 9 unit hours on child development, then you can start teaching and you get practice and more education, you become an associate teacher. But both of those levels, you need to be supervised by a teacher. And then as you get more education and experience, you can move up. Early childhood special ed, we follow the teaching credential structure. So we start with a preliminary, and that involves having a bachelor's plus. So now there's a move to have the credential, make it possible to get your credential when you're getting your bachelor's, but a lot of people have to go beyond their bachelor's to get that credential. And then once you have your preliminary, you do more coursework and experience, and you get your clear. And so when we look at this and we have in early childhood ed, this changing role in the program, but in early childhood special ed, we have the same role. And we have these paras who are wonderful, and we couldn't do it without them, but they're not really included in that. So they usually need to have either 48 units or an associate's degree. But whether or not that had any knowledge, like whether or not that included any coursework on child development or education in general, is not specified for most districts. So when we start talking, you might start talking with someone who's a program director, and that's a really great person to talk to in the early childhood side because they're responsible for a lot of decision making, but that person might not be the person that you're going to be co-teaching with because they're not the ones necessarily doing the day-to-day teaching. And when you look at what assistant and associate teachers do, they might do a lot of things that we would consider appropriate for a co-teaching relationship or what we're doing in the classroom. So that's another really big question that we have in early childhood co-teaching is like, who's your co-teacher? Who are you partnering with? Who are you planning with? And who are you assessing with? And so that's really an administrative responsibility to determine. So when you read like the K-12 like practitioner's guide to inclusion that are focused on the K-12 system, you'll hear things like, you know, make friends in the lounge. Like start with that, like make a connection, and then once you're like buddy-buddy with a teacher, then you can maybe suggest, see if they're open to this idea. And really that's not right. I don't like that as a way of establishing inclusive practice because it shouldn't be based on whether or not a teacher's willing. It should just be our practice in the field, but it's a possibility in K-12. And it's just not. Like again, we will be looking out our windows. There's the Head Start. I had state preschool and a CDC on my campus at one of the schools I worked at. I was like, I can see so many children. But when we started trying to get a system for co-teaching and inclusion, the barriers were just so high that we weren't able to surmount them. And so we really need the administrative support to help manage those issues. But now, once you've identified your co-teacher, like now what? And has anybody heard co-teaching is a marriage? Yeah, so people talk a lot about it's a marriage, but if it's a marriage, you're gonna need a prenup. And that's not, I wish that was my joke, but I know I've heard it from someone else and I don't know who, but you're gonna need to have some really difficult conversations. And because if you go into your marriage with these rose-colored glasses, sometimes you could be surprised and unhappy. And similarly, if you go into co-teaching and you think that we're just going to be, like, it's great, now we have it established, and now we can just go ahead and go to, like, our kids are going to be in the same room, and we're going to be teaching together, you may not be happy. And so you need to have some meaningful conversations. And here's some of the questions I think that we need to address specifically in early childhood. Sorry. The first is, how do you think kids learn? And this is something that comes up way more in early childhood than it does in K-12. Because we have so many different theorists that have talked about how children learn. And a lot of different early childhood curriculums have emerged from different ways of looking at child development. And so if you're in special ed, you may be, if you're like me, a behaviorist. I'll admit it, I'm a behaviorist. But if you're in gen ed, early childhood, you probably aren't. And you might have more of a Piagetian focus, you might follow Montessori. And when we start working together without having conversations, things can bubble up that surprise you. And I'm going to tell a story about this that happened in this very room. Probably about 10 years ago, when the Inclusion Collaborative started and they had those inclusion symposiums. Does anybody remember those? Yeah. One person. So they used to have like this 4-part series where programs that wanted to be, early childhood programs that wanted to be inclusive would come and they would work with a coach on issues that would related to their program to establish those sort of inclusive structures. And there was a TV over here. And so as part of like talking about what it would look like to have embedded instruction, which means that we are targeting specific student goals within an ongoing early childhood activity. There had it was really lovely, a video of a teacher who was doing the plan part of Plan, Do, Review from high scope. So it's not like a radical sort of early childhood practice. But within that plan component, they had the kids who were making their decisions. And some of the kids, she just said, where are you going to go? And they would say, I'm going to go over there. And she said, okay, go have fun. Some of the kids, she would say, where are you going to go? And they'd say, I'm going to go over there. And she would have a little conversation. Like, remember last time we had so many kids in the dramatic play area, and it was really hard? Do you think that you want to do that again? Or maybe is there another place that you could go? And she'd kind of guide them. Some other kids, she gave a forced choice of visuals, two places they could go, and the child would point, and they make a choice that way. And so I think if I can pretend to know what was going through the mind of all the special educators in the classroom, we're thinking, this is really great. This is a great mechanism for addressing maybe some challenging behaviors. It's a great way to help those kids who don't know how to get into play because they have to make a decision, and she's helping them make a decision. So they stopped the video, and they said, the facilitator says to the group, so what did you see in that video? And this woman's hand just like jumped up, like super energetically. She was bursting, ready to talk. And so they call on her, and she said, what was going on in that classroom? It looked like a prison. And it's like, the facilitators, you can see, and they were really good. It was Stephanie and Senta from a long time ago. They were really good at responding to surprising comments from the group. And so they kind of took a break and said, like, what do you mean? And she said, why are these kids being forced to make a choice like that? This is like, they're lined up, and there's this guardian who's restricting access to the play space. And it turns out that she was from a Waldorf program. And now that I know about Waldorf, I'm like, yeah, that would not fly in a Waldorf classroom. And so we talked about, they talked about like where that came from and the reasons why teachers make that decision. But if you had just gone in to CoTeach, if you had established a relationship with a program that maybe was Waldorf inspired, and you just said, oh, you know what, we can do this and we can do these forced choice, which is something that we do a lot in special ed with our kids who don't yet communicate, and we need them to learn how to communicate, or you want them to, so that way they don't engage in challenging behaviors instead. That would be a really difficult thing to just burst into the classroom with. Another one that can sometimes be challenging is Montessori, because man, those Montessori materials are like great. And if you have goals related to like early cognitive development, like math, you're gonna go in and be like, oh my gosh, so we're gonna get Timmy to do this thing like 10 times, and once he masters that, he's going to go on to this thing, and we just have it, it's so nicely set up, it's all scaffolded to get to those goals. But in Montessori, you don't make that decision for kids. and you don't force them forward. And they're really supposed to engage with those materials fairly independently. Now, I don't think it's insurmountable to have, if you have a conversation, but if you just burst into the classroom and say, oh, this is what we're going to do to meet the needs of the kids with the IEPs, you might end up with a system where either you have a fight with the teacher, or they just let you do it, but you're not really part of the class. And so you have kids kind of doing something that's really separate from the rest of the class. And so we need to have these different conversations to figure out, and that's something that we don't necessarily think about a lot, is like, how do you think kids learn? What sort of support do children need from adults? And one possible solution for this is to look at our professional organizations. So our early childhood educators are often part of, or at least familiar with, NAEYC. And they've developed a lot of resources for early childhood ed. And if you're in special ed, you might be part of the Division for Early Childhood, or at least be familiar with them, because they have established our recommended practices. And so they tell us what we should be doing. And what's wonderful is that they love each other. So they didn't always love each other. There used to be some discrepancies between the recommended practices that did make inclusion difficult, because there would be different kind of philosophies about how teachers should behave in the classroom, how directive teachers should be, and what kids should be expected to do. But in 2009, they actually put forward a joint position statement on early childhood inclusion. And at least since that time, and I believe before that time, they've worked together. So when they are establishing their recommended practices, they really reference each other. And so DEC's recommended practices reference NAEYC. And so it's not like you can't do them together. They just might look different for our friends who are learning differently. And we just need to acknowledge that they're learning differently, and so we need to engage with them differently. And so how are we going to engage with them differently, but not restrict them from all of the amazing learning opportunities that are in an early childhood program? Because there are a lot of amazing learning opportunities. So the next question related to this is, what should children learn? I just pulled this off the Head Start. If you go online and you say, like, early childhood learning framework or curriculum framework, you'll find like 1 million different curriculum frameworks. So this is the Head Start domains: approaches to learning, social, emotional, language, literacy, cognition, perceptual, motor, and physical. And for the most part, I think that one of the strengths that I see in Head Starts and state preschools is a whole child focus. I was very disappointed when I was looking for a preschool for my children that is not always the case with our private providers. And so if you are partnering with a private provider, this can become an issue because there's a lot more focus than I realized was happening on the cognitive development. So there's a lot of focus on, well, reading. And not that I think reading's great. And I think we should support early literacy, but I went into one program and they literally weren't letting the kids talk. They were like, shh, shh, shh. That was all I saw the teachers saying. And my husband even tried to talk to some of the kids because we just wanted to know, do you like it here? And they were like, shh. And so we're like, okay, this isn't the place for us. It doesn't match our goals. And so in early childhood, we do have this usually whole child focus. And it's frequently driven by the children's interests. So Montessori, Reggio, Piaget, they all have this following the child's lead in some way. And early childhood special ed, we also have that. We have a view of the child's whole development, but we also have their individual goals related to their unique learning needs. And we find that if we're in non-inclusive programs, this kind of takes over our entire life, and we kind of start from those IEP goals. Rather than starting from the whole child focus. And it's just because they're so important to us. It's what we do, it's what we're measured by. And so when we are looking at these children's unique learning goals and what we need to do in relation to them, we need to make sure that we are connecting to whatever the whole child focus is and making sure that we are relating to our early childhood gen ed peers. Now, what's nice about California is we do have the preschool learning foundations. And I have yet to find, like, okay, no, that's a lie. There are a couple different standard goals that we see on early childhood IEPs that aren't in the learning foundations, like toileting. But most of the stuff, like, I haven't found a learning foundation that I couldn't see aligning with a goal for a child with an IEP. And there's nothing that's in there that you would say, like, that's, you know, like, what's that doing in there? These are really nice foundations. And so this is a good place to start for any program that's receiving state or federal funding, to have a conversation about where are we similar and what can we do together. Oh my goodness, I'm speeding through this. Are there any questions? Okay, no. The next question is, who's responsible for the children's learning? And so when we do get together, we don't have, and so in K-12, you just have like the gen ed teacher and the special ed teacher, and sometimes you have a para also in the classroom. But usually an early childhood classroom comes with like their whole team, because they have a lead teacher and assistant teachers in the classroom. And then as a special education teacher, you probably have your team with your paraprofessionals that are working together too. And so when we are moving to co-teaching, we really want to see an overlap of assuming responsibility, so that every member of each team is responsible for everyone in the classroom. And sometimes that can be a challenge to kind of get over that. It's a little bit of a mental block. And I think for those of us in special ed, coming in with this IEP that you know that you are going to be beholden to in a year, you can start to get, like, you know, so focused on making sure that they're making progress on their goals that it can feel like the rest of the class is doing, you know, that's great for them, but we need to make sure that we're moving forward. But we do want to be working together, because our gen ed partners can do a lot to support those goals and to teach the other parts of the curriculum that we also want to address. Now this, I was so sad, because you can see this is from the Inclusion Collaborative. It has their little logo on it. I couldn't find it on their website, so it is on Sketch. If you want to see this, this model, this is roles and responsibility of special education staff and general education staff in inclusive educational settings. Now, I don't think there's ever one 100% right way to divide the different roles and responsibilities. This was a model that was created with a real-life team who was having some of these challenges where, so they, I believe this class had an itinerant model. Oh, we didn't even talk about that, where the special ed teacher went between multiple classrooms. So she would spend one day in one classroom, another day in another classroom, doing like the teacher role. But on the days that she wasn't there, her paras were the ones that were responsible for kind of helping support the classroom to support those children with IEPs, which isn't a bad model. But what happened was, apparently, the parent was working with a child with an IEP, and like really close by to her, a child got hurt, and she didn't like respond or intervene to try and like stop the child from getting hurt. And so it led to, you know, some upset in the classroom and a need for discussion. Like, you know, what is, and you know, her response was like, that's not my kid. Like, okay, we really need to move on. Like, it's not our kids and your kids. It's all of our kids. And so they made this really lovely graphic that shows the primary and secondary roles of each of the partners. So the primary role of the special ed teacher and aide was to work with the students with special needs, with their IEP goals and so on and so forth, but also with the class was to assist and support the general education staff. And then with the general education teacher and aide for this classroom, they talked about that they're responsible for kind of the whole ongoing instruction and curriculum, and then to work with the children with special needs. And at the same time, they're all ensuring children are safe at all times. And so that was a model that, first of all, is really pretty, and it worked for this classroom. Now, you might not, like, it might not always divvy up the same way based on the strengths of the individual members of the team. So every time a team member changes, I think you need to kind of go back and look at those roles and responsibilities, because you sometimes forget that, like, man, Susie's like really great with making visuals, and so she kind of just takes it over. And so she's the one who, if you want a visual support, you just like let her know, and she comes back with something that's cute and functional and it's wonderful. And then she leaves and somebody else takes her role, and maybe she's not good, or he is not good, or that's not their strength, and they're like, why do you keep giving me all of this stuff? I thought I would be doing something else. And so you just need to make sure that you're reorganizing. So how do you do that? If you go online, and I put this one on Sketch, there's a lot of roles and responsibilities lists for co-teachers to consider, which are nice. They're a nice starting point, but they never fully capture everything that you want to capture. So this one you can see has, like, so this is, again, not usually an issue in early childhood, in introducing the partnership to the class. Like, whereas in K-12, like, students are like, why are there two teachers? Like, in Head Start, if an adult goes into a Head Start classroom, like, all the kids are just like, hey, teacher, like, you must also be a teacher because you're an adult. So that's not usually an issue in early childhood. But who's responsible for planning the lesson? Identifying needed accommodations. Identifying accommodations for students with special ed services. Preparing accommodated materials for all students, special ed students, or students receiving special ed services, and so on and so forth. So this is one list, but you can always go in and think about other responsibilities, like who's responsible for talking to the parents? This is helpful for parents to know. You can let parents know. If you have a question, talk to like this person, because sometimes, parents come in and they're, like, you're an adult, let me talk to you, but you're not, that adult is not the person that can really answer their questions. So if you're, questions about like the field trips and the activities, go to Cheryl. Questions about the IEP, go to Susie, And what responsibilities are shared? I mean, ideally, you would work together and do everything together, but in a real world, you don't have like 48 hours in a day to double up and do everything together. So you're probably going to want to divide and conquer. But how can you do that in a way where you're building on each other's strengths? One way, so you can start with these lists. Another way to kind of bring up those roles and responsibilities to the fore is using an activity matrix. And I'll admit, so I found this one that I really like from the Exceptional Children Assistance Center. And they have it for elementary, middle, and high school. They don't have it for early childhood. So some of the, if you look on Sketch, you'll see it. And some of the things are very much around like a schedule that you would see in elementary school. So it doesn't quite fit, but I really love this page, which fits for everyone. And so the early childhood educator is gonna like know the classroom, the curriculum and the classroom structures. And you're gonna have like a schedule of the day, right? And you can have this conversation. So during circle, what will everyone else be doing? And so this means, what will all the kids be doing? What will this specific student be doing? And this could be a student with an IEP, or it could be a student who's just struggling to participate in circle. So what will this child be doing? What will they be doing to participate? How will we know that they're participating? Sometimes in circle, it doesn't look like sitting on the mat. Sometimes it might be standing and watching, or sitting on a chair kind of behind the rest of their friends, because sitting on that mat is just like a big, it's too much. What sort of supports are needed? So accommodations, modifications, and other ideas. How will you make sure the peers are also involved with this, if they can be involved with this? And does that time address any of the IEP goals, and if so, what? And so this is a nice way to kind of really think about each time of the day and how it's gonna look for the whole class and for the students who need extra support. And from there, you'll start seeing like, well, we need a lot of visual support. Or we have visual support in this class, but it's never referenced. This is common. We see a lot of classrooms that have really nice visual schedules, but the teacher never goes up and references it. So maybe the co-teacher can be the person who has the time to go up there and make sure to point it out or update it. And so that's one resource that you can use. Has anyone done this sort of activity with her? Yeah. And this is something, again, you could do it with in an SDC as well, but when you're starting to work in with another person, you kind of have to make it more explicit, these conversations. Another strategy, kind of an extension of the roles and responsibilities that are informed by your classroom and that schedule and what everyone's doing, is zone defense. Does anyone here use zone defense in your classroom? No. I'm glad I'm adding information. So for everyone in the classroom, so this sample that came from Intervention Central just has a 2-person schedule, but they have a blank that has 3 people, and you can just go ahead and make it, with more people. But here we have person A and person B, and they have their different time slots. So they have an arrival that's about 15 minutes, and activities and circle time, whatever language means and math means. But they have, what is each person going to be doing? Kind of where are they going to be in the classroom? And this is really awesome. Because in the middle of your ongoing activities, you don't usually have time. You might be getting grumpier and grumpier. You're like, we are about to go to art, and I do not see art materials on the table. I'm seeing nodding. But you can't, necessarily shout that out because you're in the middle of a conversation and you don't want to make kids wait while you're negotiating things with the adults in the room. And so just where in the room are you going to be? It's also nice during free play to kind of divide up the free play areas. Now, of course, if nobody's in dramatic play and everyone's in manipulative area, move over there. But if kids start going over dramatic play, we need to make sure we have a referee over there. Not just a referee, but also someone who's engaging and expanding on language and supporting all of the different amazing developmental milestones that you can support and dramatic play. So this is a nice strategy. I would do this when I was teaching. I would also have kind of when the resource providers were coming in, so our SLP and OT. Sometimes they did push-in services, and I would kind of just have that on here. If they were stepping in more and doing almost more of a co-teach, that would be on here too. But sometimes it was they're just going to be, they're going to be at this table. And so that's their zone. So that way everyone knows. It's also really nice then if you have a substitute. This is what you need to do. Any questions about zone defense? And again, this is on Sketch, and so they have a blank that you can fill out. I am going to be done really early. I always overplan, so I was like, I'm not going to overplan, but we can have a conversation after this. So another thing is that we don't want to forget the paras and assistants, and because we're not going to be successful without them. And a lot of times, especially, so assistants are coming in, assistant teachers have some coursework. Our paras may not have had any coursework, and sometimes they're just kind of thrown in. And so we need to provide the support and training for their roles, especially in co-taught classrooms. And because this is essential, because sometimes we'll see that paras who are hired for the special ed side will think, my role is to make sure this child, gets through the day. And so we're lining up. Let's go ahead and I'll hold your hand, I'll line you up, I'll get your jacket on for you. And that's not because they can't do what we want them to do, it's because often we haven't told them. And so I'm actually gonna escape out of here. I'm gonna pull up this, it's an article. Again, I put it on Sketch. That talks about a systematic approach for supporting paraeducators, a teacher's guide. And it talks about all the different roles that you might have, from one-to-one instruction, through storytelling, reading aloud, through making materials. So we have lots of different goals that when people say we really need a person, we have a lot of goals that we have for them. But sometimes we don't necessarily let them know what that is. And so this article has some training resources that are available. I'm going to keep scrolling down. It has an example of a shared philosophy for the classroom. So this can work together with each pair to kind of go over, and this is good, I think. It's good for us to do. It's something you could do with your co-teacher too. Like, what do we believe? Like, what are we committed to? How is it going to look in the classroom? So that way everyone gets on the same page. Sorry, I know this is kind of small to look at. And then we're going to keep scrolling down. Oh, we need to have meetings. So if you're an administrator, please give planning time to everyone on the team. Because that's another challenge that we face with our teacher level, is that the early childhood teachers, like, I'm here, like, 7 to, what's 8 hours after 7? 5, I don't know. That's probably not right. And I'm in the class, and I'm teaching. Like, and my planning time is kind of times that I can break away from the group, but it's not like I have the prep period or the prep time that is embedded into a teacher schedule because of the union that teachers are in. So making sure, whoops. So now, questions, sorry. So questions for kind of an assessment. And these are good questions for an interview, if you're interviewing people to hire. And then we have a sample evaluation form. And so this is an example for an autism program that was maybe more discrete trial. But I still think that you can use a model like this. So if you have the time to do some observations with your peers and assistant teachers, what are we looking for in this? Like, in our art periods or in our art activities in early childhood, we're often not looking for a perfect model of whatever it is that we wanted, right? We're not looking for, you made something that looks exactly like the teachers. We're looking for that they had the ability, that they had the opportunity to cut, and they had the opportunity to draw. And in that activity, you labeled what they were doing, and you built upon student language. And so you can have those sort of written out and just do a little observation and say, you know what? You did a great job today with X, Y, and Z, but one area that we want to focus on is maybe building on student language. And what does that mean? How would you do it? Or maybe just like not talk. This was my weakness. We just need you to stop talking. So that way the kids have the opportunity to talk, right? And that's I would just like kind of fill all the empty space so the kids didn't have a chance. So I would always be working on that. So then we have the written plan through different activities. So we have in all groups, in the calendar, snack, language, and project groups, kind of the visual supports that were needed, and general group goals. And so this is similar to that, what you would make with that activity sheet, and then it highlights some of those individual goals for children with IEPs. Whoops, if you push the over button, that's what's happening. Okay. And then this is just some specific plans for teaching a specific skill. And it includes that, wait 5 seconds. So check your schedule, wait 5 seconds, and then prompting. Or standing away from the student. Again, because you sometimes get so, and I do this with my own preschooler right now, like, just come on, we're gonna get to the car, we're gonna do it. But so, if I were going to teach that skill rather than full-on prompted every morning, I would maybe stand away and give her a chance to do it independently. We just don't have time in the morning, we need to get to the car. And so some nice written plans to teach those skills. And so this is a nice article to reference. So that's the end of it. And to think about supporting our paras. And also, I do think a lot of it is a reminder for us as teachers. Well, there's my girls. Okay, so we're done early. So let's have a conversation. Any questions or thoughts? Yeah. So Waldorf is a developmental curriculum. So it takes like more of a hard left at the nature side, like so letting kids work through their own processes. It's very creative. Like the kids that I've known who've gone to Waldorf, they often do a lot of like, they'll start knitting really young. Like it has a lot of creative art stuff. But if kids don't want to do X, like they don't have to. Like the stance is they're not ready for it. And it is true in our young children. Sometimes you have kids who are like, I'm going to figure out how to climb today. Like this is, I'm just so focused on climbing. That's like what my body wants to do. And so I'm doing it, even if it's nap time, even if it's lunchtime, I'm working on that. And so I'm not making progress on language, and we often see that sort of plateau in one domain while we're making progress in another domain. But they kind of follow that to an extreme. That might not catch when a child is just not making progress in one of the domains. And so, again, I don't think it's impossible for there to be an overlap in a relationship between like a Waldorf. And what we find is that sometimes like it's not a Waldorf like transitional kindergarten. It's a teacher who got their credential, and now the school district has a transitional kindergarten, and they say, oh, you used to teach preschool. And then that teacher might take some of the practice that she or he learned from their Waldorf school, and now it's being put in place in the TK, and it can be really lovely. But then when we're working, and many people in special ed either explicitly or implicitly have that behavioral orientation because, just doing what is typical isn't making progress in a child's life, and so we need to make that support. Any other questions? Or thoughts about, or struggles that you've had?
Just curious. Different models. That's my question was always, because I did CoTeaching for 2 years. Did not work. And so we kind of like stopped and we went more to an itinerant model. And that was because our concerns and our questions weren't being heard by by who was with another agency like St. Preschool. They weren't really listening to our concerns. So they're not willing to, help them work with us.
Yeah.
Make sure we have the right fit. Then it's.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of what happened. So I know I would like to go back to that. But the issues that we had was, my idea was like, is there other models like that would make it work? Because right now I'm itinerant, sort of the whole county basically.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? So like, is there a model that works for kids where you would teach 1 day, 2 days a week, and then the other days would be the general ed teacher? And so I'm just curious if you have
that's been a kind of a common model because we just don't have, unless you want to bring 12 children with IEPs into a program, which generally isn't going to fly. I mean, there's just not that many spaces, and you don't want to all of a sudden have like 30 children in the preschool classroom. A lot of early childhood programs do use the itinerant model, and I think that I've seen successes with it, and then I've seen challenges. And I think a lot of the challenges that I've seen have come from the lack of communication. So, if you are co-teaching and you go into the classroom and you don't yourself know the schedule, like how are you going to take on the teaching role? And so I think some of these supports may be helpful, maybe. Like that zone defense, like just, tell me like what sort of activity do you want me to be in? I mean, ideally it would be something that we could become together, but if the early childhood teacher thinks that I'm still like leading every activity and you're just there to support it, that's not really making the most of what we can bring to the classroom as special educators. I'm sorry. I always come back to we being special educators because that was my background. But we want to maybe have a conversation around what sort of challenges are you having with kids? Like not kids with potential identifiable disabilities, but just challenges that we might be having in the classroom. We have a lot of English learners in the area. They also benefit from visual support. How can we work to use these systems that we're putting in, maybe intentionally for our students who have IEPs that require that they have a visual schedule. But how can we make this something that actually supports the whole classroom? And so that tends to be we're kind of lucky with the English learners in this area because that's such a big need in our classrooms that a lot of the general education side are like, oh, you can make those, or you can do that, or like, you know, you come in with just so many different ideas of how it can look. That tends to be kind of a like, oh yes, come and help me now, because it does take a lot of time to do that. But I think it does need some administrative support. I'm very curious. I want to go and see. I think everyone that I've talked to is like, I really want to go see that program in Pleasanton and just see how it's looking, right? Like but in that model, they have the person with the teaching credential, and the assistant teacher really is like used to be a para. So I'm not sure that they're really like co-teaching so much as now they have someone with that support that has some of that knowledge. It would be really interesting to see what maybe the co-teaching might look like.
But more
Yeah.
than anything, it's the general ed peers that probably have made the biggest difference within this program.
Yeah, and I mean, we see that. Like there's research on not very well supportive inclusive opportunities in early childhood that really make amazing gains in language. Now, we don't want to just put kids in it. Like, that's not going to work because it's, you know, that's usually where they came from. They usually came from some sort of daycare or preschool, and they weren't doing well. Or not always, but oftentimes that's kind of like for kids who have SLI, that was like the teacher who said, you know, hey parents, have you looked at this, or has your pediatrician said something, and maybe you can go get these resources. And it doesn't work when, or it's not, we don't want it to be not supportive because the challenging behaviors emerge, and we can do a lot more if we're intentional about supporting language, but just the interaction with peers who really, you know, I love preschoolers because they just run up and talk to people. Not my older daughter. My older daughter was like, you come talk to me. But whenever I would go and, like, she'd go into her class and she'd be like doing her own thing, and all the kids would just come up and talk to her anyway, which was good for her. And so we see a lot of benefit in early childhood just through that, those sort of interactions. Any other questions? I wish I had an answer. I wish I had a magic bullet. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, and I do think it's, you know, the more we get administrators in this conversation to kind of help with some of these, you know, because we know, like, and it's not like I am innocent of having some territory that I, you know, don't want to give up, or I feel is mine, but sometimes we have to give up some of our territory. We have to blend it to make these systems work inclusively. And I think that's something that our administrators can really help with when we're struggling.
And choosing teachers that can bend. Because
Yeah.
some older styles that are, no, the kids are going to sit in their seat, and they're not going to wiggle, and they're not going to do this.
Yeah.
And you can just have meetings and talk about everything.
Yeah. If you're having, yeah, that seems like that's an early childhood ed problem. Like, that's not really following NIEYC recommendations for what should be happening in early childhood if you're not allowed to wiggle.
I think that's like 95% of the puzzle is put in the right place.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have to, and that's where the admin that'll help you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to throw out that we actually just started our CoTeacher.
Uh-huh. Oh, great.
We've been in it first since this school year.
Everyone give them a round of applause. Because it's hard.
Really good. I think it just takes a matter of finding the right people, like you said, people who are flexible,
Mm-hmm.
willing to like take on these challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been doing really good, and I feel like our kids are actually included with the rest of the students.
Mm-hmm.
We have 4 with IEPs,
Mm-hmm.
and we have 16 general ed,
Mm-hmm.
and they're all, and we've been able to like figure out what they need, and then we do them with the other children, and get the other children to do with them, for them to like, why do they get that extra support, you know?
Yeah.
I feel like we've been doing really good.
Okay, great. Which school district?
We work in Barbados and Salinas.
In Salinas. Oh, you're so far away. I have to go down there and see.
That way in the morning, you'll be fine.
Yeah, I guess that's true. It's probably faster than getting like the 3 miles I need to go in the morning. That takes me half an hour.
So we have 2 classrooms. This is our second classroom. We did a classroom last year, so I'm the administrator of the state preschool program.
Okay, great.
I worked really closely with our special ed director in our district, and I learned a lot last year. We had too many kids with IEPs last year. The teachers kind of rolled with the bumps,
Yeah.
We got some people changed out, and
Mhm.
that wasn't for them. They moved on,
Mhm.
and that was good as well
Mhm.
because we're kind of learning like
Yeah.
you can't have people in there that aren't gonna that haven't bought into the whole
Yeah.
system. So that was
Yeah.
key. So I started prepping this team that I have here last year. I started
Mhm.
putting them in training
Good.
for the Inclusion Collaborative and
Yeah.
talking to them
Good.
about, and they visited
Mhm.
classrooms. We have
Mhm.
a kindergarten, and now we have the first grade in our district
Oh, good.
that are doing full inclusion.
Mhm.
So I had them go visit those
Mhm.
classrooms. I also am going to send them to visit our
Mhm.
special day classes. So
Mhm.
they have all three models.
Kind of know what it is. Yeah.
The difference.
Yeah.
So our district is working really hard to
To.
create this model and make it work.
Mhm.
So I'm really happy that
And that is good because sometimes I'll hear, luckily, I'm not, hopefully not, this hasn't happened to any of you in here, but I'll hear from like a gen ed side, like, I got called a week before the school year started and told, voluntold, that we were doing this, and I'd never heard of co-teaching. I don't know how to look at an IEP. Like, I had no idea, and like that's just like so, like scary. I've been teaching, and I know I'm a good teacher, but now like you're asking me to change, and I don't know what you want me to change into. And so taking those steps, doing that, looking at the different programs, like that is such an amazing support that you're providing. I see his hand back in back that shot up. Yeah, yeah, you. Sorry.
I was just wondering what your ratios were in your inclusion program. The staffing? No, your special ed to gen ed. We have a total of 20 students. 4 of them are students with IEP, and 16 are gen ed. But in the gen ed students, there's still a couple more that might get identified. But we didn't intentionally place them in the classroom. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And when you said it was too many, how many were too many? So last year we had a classroom of 27 students, and 9 of them had IEPs, and 3 more could have potential. So possibly 12 students. And it was too much staff and too much. But we had 2
Yeah.
classrooms that we could work with. So some of the pullout happened like maybe in the classroom next door, but the kids had the flex to go from these 2 different classrooms with
Mm-hmm.
doors in them. So I kind of learned a lot. So that one is modeled this year. That classroom
Mm-hmm.
is the same as this classroom. There's 2 gen ed preschool teachers, and then this guy teacher, and then if the students need it, there's a para or EIS. I'm learning all these terms and new for me. So potentially like trials. We're from Lincoln, and we started our inclusion. We had an itinerant program for the last 5 years, right? And now this year we've done away with preschool special day classes.
Oh, let's do round of applause for that. But before the but, we need applause.
I mean, it's really awesome. We have a 60-40 ratio in the classroom for students on IEPs and not on IEPs, and some might, be identified. The total number of students is 20. We haven't been able to hire a gen ed preschool teacher, so we have a special ed teacher in there, and then 3 paras for support, and then whatever gen ed preschool sub teacher comes in, but really the special ed teacher is.
Yeah. That is like, I hear your frustration, and what's interesting about that is I feel like a lot of times it's the opposite. You can't find the special ed teacher because shortage, and then if you're in that relationship, you can't really form that co-teaching relationship. You can't be married. You're like speed dating, or have lots of one-night stands, and those can be fun, but not really long-term material, right? And so.
How am I getting to my goals for my enrollments? Like now it's time to
Yeah.
do the benchmarks, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't get to see them enough because I'm working with all 20. So,
Yeah.
but the benefit for the students
Mhm.
is phenomenal.
Yeah.
I love it so much more than last year having my special day class and doing the mainstream into the preschool program.
Yeah, which always seems like, oh, this is going to be a nice like move, but then it never really worked because the schedules are always like slightly off. Like you're supposed to be there at whatever time, and like in any classroom, but I think especially in early childhood, you're not following the clock, right? You're following their lead, and so you're always kind of dropping in at the wrong time and having to leave at the wrong time. And so I'm excited. I'm happy to hear that. And I feel like this is what I hear in with the move to inclusion in early childhood is almost all the teachers are, I don't want to give it up, even when there's challenges. Like you're not over it. You just want to find a program that works. and finding that match, I think, is a key point. Mm-hmm. That actually might make the whole thing a little bit easier. This is like my kind of radical idea with early childhood special ed in Santa Clara. I'm like, there's so many. We have 31 districts in the county, and some of them are just one school. And I'm like, maybe it was just all county programs. It's true. And then they could, whatever system would be consistent, and like you wouldn't be getting a different level of support or provision because you happen to live on this side of a street. Yes. So that would be an issue here too, is just the size. I wanted to say something. Oh, so this is way back when I was in Tennessee, which is where I got my credential. I was in a program that had a child that would be, I think, categorized as medically fragile out here. She was going on 6, going into kindergarten, and she was kind of like functionally on all of the assessments around 1. And she had A syndrome. They weren't more, like, it was one of these things where it was like, oh, the doctor found out about another child in New Zealand who is similar. So it's a very, like, whatever it is rare, so I can't give it a name. But her nervous system was more like a neonate. Like, all of her reflexes were still there, and she was very sensitive to touch. And so, but she was, I mean, we were able to include her in our early childhood program fairly well, because we had a really good PT who helped us with all of the positioning stuff. And her goals, again, like when you have preschool, like kind of the goals were related. That district had full inclusion to the 4th grade, and the kindergarten teacher who came in was shocked and unhappy. And so that was going to be where the issue was going to be next year. But it worked pretty, so it can work. But I think you do need the resource providers to provide that sort of assistance. And in that program, we did also, I don't know what Tennessee's version of county is. Like, we didn't have that. But the kids who needed extra support, so we had a 3-hour preschool program, and then there was like kind of DTT that you could go to after. So like some of that extra provision that wouldn't really fit into a preschool classroom was in addition, which I like in theory. Like, I think that's a really nice idea. So that way the kids are getting as much interaction as they can with their typical peers. And then if you need something else, kind of like you go to the doctor, if you need something else, you go and get that support in addition. So any other questions or thoughts? I can let you guys go. I'm not sure if breakfast is still out there, but thank you very much. And do look on Sketch if you want any of those materials. I was so proud of myself for getting them in time. I was like, Get them added in time. Okay. Oh, thanks.